When you think of legendary tracks, you think of Le Mans, the Monaco Grand Prix, the Nürburgring. But on the other side of the world, there is a place that combines each of those legendary circuits into one lap. This is the Mount Panorama circuit, nicknamed after its hometown of Bathurst. What is now a racetrack started as a Wiradjuri settlement of Aboriginal Australians next to a mountain called Wahaloo, or a young man's initiation place. They have no idea how right they would be, but also, side note, for any Australians angry at that, I do apologize. I'm not an Aboriginal Australian. I'm an idiotic American. I'm doing my best. But in the meantime, the British, shocker, forced out the Aboriginal inhabitants and founded the gold rush town of Bathurst in 1815, and by 1906, the Australians started racing there. Now, the first track was built for a rich guy to drive a steam-powered car on, but it was later used for motorcycle racing. And motorcycle racing grew to the point where there were two tracks, and eventually organizers decided to make a new circuit to replace them both. The Vale Circuit officially opened in 1931 and was a 7.2-mile-long monster that allowed speeds of 90 miles an hour. That's not as fast as other bike events even back then, but the difference at Bathurst was the circuit. It was partially a street course that used public roads stretching over Mount Tamar, but unlike any other street circuit I've ever seen, the organizers simply put a dirt mound on the road and allowed normal traffic to flow on one side of the dirt while the racers flew by on the other side. I can already see OSHA representatives crying in the corner, sucking their thumb just on hearing that. And this carried on for 6 years until the crowds became so big they needed a proper circuit. The new circuit was built on the old Aboriginal land and was connected together by an isolated stretch of public road draped over a mountain, now renamed, because Westerners and all, Mount Panorama. It was smaller, around 6.1 miles, but it was very fast. Essentially, it was 3 straightaways connected by right angles that was then connected to a public mountain road. The Conrod Straight alone was 1.2 miles long and is easily the fastest and most dangerous section of the circuit. It may not be as narrow as the mountain section, but with the speeds hitting 180 miles an hour by the end of the original track layout, the cars were actually getting airborne on the second crest. Out of the 16 deaths in Bathurst history, 6 of them were in crashes on the straightaway. Eventually, a kink was created to trim the straight down to FIA specifications by adding a new section of the track called the Chase. And the second crest was flattened in time for the 1987 World Touring Car Championship. But the irony is, it didn't even work, because as power increased with the new modern V8 supercars, the speeds are now cracking 190 miles an hour. Although they aren't, taking off, so I guess that's a good thing. But 190 miles an hour is faster than the GT class at Le Mans. And the lap times also plummeted despite the increase in track length from a 2:09 set by a Formula 5000 car 1970 to a 1:59.3 set by a de-restricted Audi R8 LMS in 2018. Although it should be noted that the unofficial lap record is held by Jenson Button in his McLaren MP423 F1 car at a 1:48.88. But to sum all of that up, the Chase remains one of the only significant changes in Bathurst history. Bathurst really hasn't changed all that much, which is kind of amazing, given how much Le Mans and the Nürburgring want to have changed. This thing has stayed pretty consistent. There have been talks recently to add taller barriers to the mountain section when several GT cars started sending debris over the wall, but it's difficult to do since it's technically private property. So, we know the track, but what about the races that happen on the track? Well, Bathurst first opened in 1938 and held motorcycle races and the Australian GP. Les Sheeran won the first ever Bathurst event at the 1938 Junior Tourist Trophy motorcycle race, while Peter Whitehead won the first automotive race at the Australian GP shortly afterwards. Then war broke out, And obviously racing did not fully resume until 1946, and by 1950 there was a new premier race. By this point, the Australian GP had started to alternate around various circuits, so the organizers created the Bathurst 100, a 100-mile race which was first won by Doug Whiteford in his, rather fittingly, Ford V8 Special. And the Bathurst 100 became a staple of the track, being held every year but one, until 1963, because by then, there was a new variety of racing series, including 6-hour, 12-hour, and even 24-hour endurance races for GT cars, as well as various spec series. And out of all of those, the 12-hour endurance race is still going strong with healthy support from Mercedes, Audi, Porsche, KTM, Lamborghini, and Ford. But there is one event that is even more famous. The Bathurst round of the Australian Touring Car Championship from 1963 to 1972, the round was held in a 500-mile format, while from 1973 and onwards, it followed a 1,000-kilometer format. But both eras adhered to the typical class structure of Australian touring cars at the time, whether that be Group C, Group A, Super Touring, and most recently, Supercars. Now, unlike other Australian Touring Car Championship races, this event is so long that it requires a team of 2 drivers. And it is also unique to other ATCC races in that its qualifying features a shootout for pole position after the main qualifying session. So this shootout has the top 10 fastest drivers of the day going against the clock to re-qualify for their top 10 positions. So it feels more like time attack than a traditional qualifying session, and it's one of the highlights of a very highlight-filled weekend. It's bloody brilliant. Now, early 500s were dominated by existing European touring cars like the Ford Cortina that took a hat-trick of wins between 1963 and 1965, or the Mini Cooper S that won in 1966. But then in 1967, something changed. Australian cars started to get really fast, and the Ford Falcon GT led the charge. The Falcon had never raced before its entry in the 1967 Bathurst 500, but with a hefty 289 cubic inch V8 powering it down the straightaways, the Falcon GT won first try. And from that point on, every single race but 5 would be won by either Ford or Holden in what remains one of the biggest rivalries in motor racing history. Holden and Ford have battled it out almost non-stop for 55 years, from 1967 to 2022. But it couldn't go on forever because, well, GM did what they do best. They killed the Holden division in 2019, with the last Commodores retiring at the end of the 2022 season. But they did not go quietly into that good night, scoring Holden's 36th and final win at Bathurst in 2022. That was a very touching moment for Australians and one of the most impactful and emotional Bathursts in memory. It may be emotional, but it's not the greatest. See, a track as intense as Bathurst with rivalries as intense as Ford and Holden is bound to produce legendary races, from Pete Brock's 1979 domination that saw him win by 6 laps, to 1992 where the R32 GTR of Jim Richards and Mark Skaife took the win despite hydroplaning into the wall. But there are 2 events that really stand out to me. The 1972 event was the last race run with the old 500-mile duration, but it was also the first time the race was heavily affected by rain. Sure, it had rained in the past, but not to such an extent as 1972, and that threw a spanner in the already interesting race. At this point in Bathurst history, everybody was building homologation specials just for the event. So Ford had the Falcon GTHO Phase 3, and Holden had the Tirana GTR XE1. The Falcon of Alan Moffat had a much more powerful engine that allowed it to thunder down the straightaways, while Peter Brock's Holden could reel it back in on the twisty mountains, the old David versus Goliath thing in some respects. But the rain ruined the Ford's ability to deploy its horsepower, and Brock was able to hold off multiple attacks from multiple different Fords to score his first of 9 wins at Mount Panorama, a record that still stands to this day and has cemented Peter Brock as the undisputed king of the mountain. And yet, I would argue there is still one even better. After the typically epic top 10 qualifying shootout, the 2014 event looked set for a standard Holden versus Ford battle. And it was actually so dramatic we have a starring cast. Featuring the 2017 winner Luke Yolden, who took pole position with fellow Holden driver Shane Van Gisbergen in second. Then behind them we find the previous year's winner Mark Winterbottom and his Ford down in fourth, with rookie Scott McLaughlin and his Volvo behind him respectively. Then there's a bit of a gap to Jamie Whincup's Holden down in 24th place in front of the Ford of Chas Mostritz. And if you're wondering why 7-time supercar champion Jamie Whincup is starting 24th in a race he's already won 4 times by now, well, during qualifying he did not display those skills and threw away his fastest lap by bending it into the wall. And when the race began, the entire front group of champions I just mentioned got absolutely dusted off the line by the rookie of Scott McLaughlin in his Volvo. And he wasn't the only one. Both Whincup and Mostard's teammate Paul Morris also started making their way up through the field, and by lap 22, Whincup was in the lead doing some of the finest driving Bathurst has seen in a long while. He was absolutely rocketing on another level. But then there was a safety car. Yolden, our pole sitter, hit a kangaroo, which sent him into the pits for repairs, and the recovery crew to remove the dead animal carcass. And almost at the exact same time, Morris binned his Falcon into the wall at turn 2, which also sent him into the pits for repairs. And that became a bit of a theme this race, that turn 2 barrier just could not catch a break. The Nissan Altima of James Moffat and Taz Douglas crashed in the turn 2 tire wall for the second time that day. And then shortly afterwards, Scott Pye destroyed the turn 2 tire barrier once and for all for the 4th time and drew out the safety car. So, there was a delay for the dead kangaroo. That delay was compounded by the fixes to the turn 2 tire wall. That delay was compounded by Dale Wood crashing into his teammate behind the safety car. That delay was compounded by the lights falling off of said safety car. And that delay was compounded by the racetrack, disintegrating. Yeah, they resurfaced the track before the race, and it turns out turn 2 was resurfaced a little too late, and it broke apart. So the broken track surface drew a red flag out for only the 3rd time in history. And after all of that, the race resumed 1.5 hours later, with everyone's cars fixed up just enough to keep racing. That was actually a bit of contention. Some teams were very angry, as you would imagine that their rivals were allowed to fix their cars while they waited 1.5 hours. But they didn't have to wait very long, because another crash brought another safety car on lap 65, which turned out to be a big help for Whincup, who, after his fantastic charge through the field, got into an accident of his own. And that safety car, plus one just 6 laps later, and another one on lap 91, somehow dragging Whincup and the rest of the repaired cars from earlier back onto the lead lap and back into contention. Which meant we start the second half of the race in a race of attrition, as multiple mechanical failures set in and forced retirements, but no safety car. No, the person who brought the safety car, that honor would go to Scott McLaughlin, battling for victory, throwing his Volvo into the wall at lap 119, but there was still one last pit stop for everybody still running, and they got the perfect time to do it when, with 28 laps to go, turn 2 claimed another victim, when Lee Holdsworth was pile-drived into the wall like he was playing Forza. So this meant the stage was already set for a very interesting finale, when one last safety car with 13 to go made it even more interesting. Essentially, it made a 4-horse sprint between the 2 Fords of Winterbottom and Mostritz somehow, and the 2 Holdens of Lowndes and Whincup also somehow. And that quickly became an old-fashioned 1v1 when Lowndes spun out Winterbottom like an idiot and got a drive-through penalty. So, we now have Ford versus Holden, 2 warring factions represented by the 2 drivers who started 24th and 25th on the grid and who both crashed during the race. That just shows more than anything else that you never give up. The fact that they started out at the back of the pack, fought their way through the field, got crashed, fell a lap down, recovered that lap, and they're now fighting for the lead. Speaks volumes to just how insane Bathurst can be. But there was one other battle going on that not many people were aware of. Whincup versus Fuel. Since he didn't pit on the lap 150 safety car, he was being told to conserve his fuel. But doing that would guarantee Mostert overtaking him, and well, he is a racing driver. If he has a chance to win, especially the biggest race of the year in Australia, he's gonna take it. And he pushed like hell to build up a massive lead with 3 laps to go in order to give himself a bit of a buffer despite his team's begging to slow down. But as the fuel ran dry, the Ford drew closer and closer and closer until the last lap, where there was just 0.3 of a second between them. Whincup was defending like crazy. Mostert could not get through on the mountain section. He was all over his bumper. And Whincup held out as long as he could, but Mostert did not have to worry about fuel, and he was absolutely flying. And he got his nose up the inside, heading on the Conrad Straight, and it was all over. Whincup's engine died heading into the chase, and all he could do was hold in the clutch. After nearly 8 hours, Chaz Mostert and Paul Morris won the Bathurst 1000, having started 25th on a 25-car grid with a crash into the wall to boot. Jamie Whincup did finish coasting across the line in 5th position, which meant that the number 360 Nissan of James Moffat and Taz Douglas, if you recall from the beginning, the car that crashed twice into the Turn 2 barrier, came second. And the Commodore of Nick Paracat and Oliver Gavin then rounded out third as the only podium finisher not to be in the Turn 2 wall at some point in the day. The 2014 race was one for the history books. 8 hours, 10 safety cars, 3 crashes for the top 2 finishers, and a win that came down to a last lap shootout between 2 cars that nearly didn't start the race at all. In my opinion, it's not just the greatest Bathurst of all time, it's one of the greatest races of all time, joining the likes of Canada 2011, Le Mans 2016, and Daytona 76. That race embodied everything great about Australian motorsport. Wheel-to-wheel battles, unpredictability, intense rivalries, all on one of the best tracks on Earth. We may have lost that great rivalry, but regardless of whether it's Falcon versus Commodore, Mustang versus Camaro, Australian motorsport is in safe hands at Mount Panorama.